sexy legs, I say. See them girls rolling them new coops, I say. Everybody think I look, you should say. I see them girls with them pretty toes, I say. See them girls with them sexy legs, I say. See them girls rolling them new coops, I say. Everybody think I look, you should say.
like us, life seems to have only one single purpose: gaining time. Life seems to have only one single purpose: gaining time. And it is going through time seems to be also the only real purpose of each of the cells in our bodies. To achieve that aim, the mass of the cells that make up earthworms and human beings has only two solutions: be immortal or to reproduce. If its habitat is not sufficiently favorable or nurturing, cell will choose immortality. In other words, self-sufficiency and self-management.